We do have a guest speaker, and I'm going to talk very little because I want her up here to talk more. But we have Sarah Miller-Caldicott, who's the CEO of Power Patterns of Innovation, and she's coming to talk to us. This is your second book, correct?
That's right.
Second book. And by the way, for those, I think we can order it for everyone who wants to ping me, and for those of you here, she'll take care of you afterwards. So. But she has been involved with Fortune 500 companies about driving innovation and change and collaboration. And here's the interesting thing. She spent a lot of time developing her career the last 15 or so years in her company about looking at one of her ancestors, which happens to be Thomas Edison. And so the good thing here is that she's got some lineage in the fact that innovation and collaboration and things that are just beyond some of our comprehension. And the interesting thing here is that if you think in that context, this is a lasting impression that this particular individual left with us, and we continue to use the inventions and the processes and the procedures that this individual brought. So I will keep it short and ask her to come up and join us. So Sarah, come on up. Okay. And we all call this the pickle. And I know you've been at Cisco. You've helped with a lot of the labs. So this is your fourth or fifth
That's right.
join us with. So we're excited to have you back. And I will turn you over to the crowd, give you the pickle, and you can do your thing.
Terrific. Thanks so much, Kurt.
Pleasure. And it's a pleasure to be with all of you here, as well as the audience around the world. We are going to speak about an extraordinary individual this morning, someone, as Kurt said, who made a lot of magic happen. Some of you may know Thomas Edison as the Wizard of Menlo Park. And this was a nickname that he garnered from the press, actually, because all of his inventions were so extraordinary that people wanted to learn more. They wanted to flock and understand how the extraordinary inventions that Edison generated were developed. Edison is not only a world-famous innovator, but he is America's most extraordinary innovator. And that's really saying something, because we are a nation of innovators. This is really our DNA. If we look at Thomas Edison, someone who was born before the Civil War, in 1847 and died during the Great Depression in 1931. This is an extraordinary sweep of history, 84 years. Edison not only lived during good economic times, he lived during difficult economic times. He competed with Alexander Graham Bell and many other inventors of his age. So we can look to Edison for many of the sweeps of ups and downs, just as we experience today. Edison had 1,093 U.S. patents and 1,293 international patents. So Edison was doing business internationally before there was radio, before there was plastic. He really was a global thinker. I became so captivated with Thomas Edison as a young girl when I learned in second grade that I was a great-grandniece of this extraordinary man. There's an entire lineage of inventors in our family, starting with this gentleman you see in the left side of the screen here, Lewis Miller. He was an agricultural equipment inventor. He had 92 patents and 11 children. So he was a very busy guy. The fifth child was my great-grandfather, and the seventh child you see in the middle there, Mina Miller, and she married Thomas Edison in 1886. So she was the daughter of an inventor and then the wife of an inventor. She was the love of Edison's life and really allowed his genius to flourish. The gentleman on the right is my grandfather, who invented shatterproof glass after World War II. So a very interesting spectrum of American innovation in my family, dating back years and years. So this captivated my imagination. What does it take to innovate decade after decade? What kinds of courage and persistence do you need to have to keep going, to keep your business thriving, to hire the right people, to create teams that are going to develop breakthrough solutions? Having worked in the Fortune 500 for over 15 years, I led innovation teams both here in the United States and globally. And I wanted to understand how Edison repeated his success. It's very hard to innovate. It's a challenging process. We come upon barrier after barrier. Sometimes those are internal and sometimes they're external. But I wanted to look in Edison's notebooks, in his correspondence. I wanted to get the actual gist of what he was thinking as he was innovating and how he ran so many successful businesses, not only here in the US, but overseas. Edison was an extraordinary man who established over 200 companies in his lifetime. Now imagine that. Some of these were utilities, which we might recognize today, but over 2/3 of those companies were manufacturing operations. Edison had over 3,000 employees, including his US and overseas operations. So we don't often think of him as really running this massive global empire. But he had people who he counted on, people who were catalysts, people who were managers and leaders in many parts of the world, and they kept the culture of discovery and innovation going throughout this extraordinary expanse of companies. One of them we can see today, the Edison General Electric Company, which today we know as GE. And I know Cisco is a partner with GE. GE is really continuing the Edison legacy and has pioneered the industrial internet. We're moving toward the Internet of Everything, which I think is something Edison would really embrace and find extraordinarily compelling. So this world of research and development, this world of manufacturing, is something that set Edison in motion and something that he really valued and kept him passionate every day. Part of the magic, as Kurt said, that Edison was able to bring to these companies was ingenuity. He hired people with many different skill sets. He believed it was important to have multiple competencies within his organizations. And I think that ingenuity is an extraordinary word that brings together this notion of collaboration and innovation. Now, this picture that you see here has all men in it. But there are people who speak 12 languages in this photo. There are people from all over the world. And if we were in modern times, there would be women in this image as well. Edison believed that men and women held equal intellect, which in the 1880s and 1890s was a revolutionary notion. So this thought about ingenuity is something that's very important, bringing all of the skill sets together in an integrated way. Importantly, Edison didn't just develop and design the Menlo Park Laboratory in New Jersey, which was the world's first R&D facility, and you see that in the left frame here. He didn't just have labs over the course of this 62-year career that I've mentioned. He had multiple business models. When he was in the world of electrical power, he actually designed the footprints for the power station. He had a construction division that actually built the power stations. He had people that would go out and canvass the streets to figure out where the power lines should run. He had people going into homes to examine where should the lights go, where should the switches go. So this was an extraordinarily different set of business models that he had during his lifetime, some 6 altogether. So there were products and services that he was delivering consistently over the course of his career. One of the common denominators, however, was collaboration. Edison really viewed collaboration as the on-ramp to innovation. If you can collaborate successfully, you can innovate successfully. If Edison had not had collaborative teams, if he had not focused on that in his culture, he could not have moved as quickly, and he could not have generated as many patents as he did. Small teams, specifically, were very powerful and important for Edison. Teams of 6, 7, 8 people, sometimes as few as 2. This was the unit of innovation, and Edison was able to piece together and stitch together these small teams as he needed to endeavor larger projects. But he valued the nimbleness of the small team, and he wanted to keep that a part of his culture, which he was successful in doing. Now, if we look at some of the industries that Edison left us, there are 6 that he pioneered in 30 years. Now imagine that you could create 6 disruptive technologies that would deliver market value in just 30 years. We can look at the world of technology and networks alone and see tremendous change in 30 years. Not only did Edison pioneer all 6 of the industries that you see here, including recorded sound, electrical power, and the movies, but he created market value from these industries. His patents and the industries you see here were valued at $500 billion in 1931, at the time of his death. So that's a pretty good day. At that time, that was 3% of global GDP. So Edison was not only hiring these extraordinary individuals, creating an environment in which they could work, but they were actually delivering products and services that people wanted. So this is the Holy Grail. This is what we're aiming for. This is what we're striving for in the 21st century. So we see today so many changes in how collaboration can happen. And your organization is all about collaboration. People working remotely, people generating thoughts, people solving problems in all parts of the world. So the networks that we have, the smart devices that we have, are even more important in that process now. But what we also see is the speed and the scale which with new ideas can come into being. We look at Uber, we look at Spotify, Pandora, Square, and others that have really accelerated their time to mass success. 2, 3 years, sometimes 4. But this is more normative now. We're seeing this over and over again, and this disruptive environment that we're in is causing us to think newly about what collaboration is. How do we kind of up our game so that we can collaborate more effectively in this disruptive environment? One of the very important things that I'd like you to take away from our conversation here today is there's a difference between collaboration and teamwork. A lot of times we think of those terms as synonymous, but really Edison wanted a collaboration to be a reflection of a group of individuals who were bringing their expertise together and sharing that, actually learning from each other, much more so than just checking off items on a task list. A lot of times teams are more about, how do I hand the baton off to you, and you go and do your part and I'm done. So there's no question that there's certain types of efficiency that we want to ensure we sustain. But we don't want to push some of that discovery learning and that sharing of expertise off the table. If we take a look at the first team that developed the incandescent electric light, these are the qualities, these are the capabilities that were present on the team. And I'll just highlight a few for you. Glassblower, machinist, mathematician, physicist. There's even a chemist on this team. Now, if you were a leader and you were going to draw together people to try to create a breakthrough in lighting, is this the group that you would choose? It probably wouldn't look like this. It would probably be lots of engineers and perhaps some physicists, and that's all good. But sometimes we don't look broadly enough at the types of skill sets that could contribute to a solution. We get very narrow. So Edison never had all engineers or all acoustical scientists or all people who were an expert in a particular field on a given team. He wanted to spread those people around to multiple projects. So this is part of that ingenuity. This is part of that integration of thinking that I think we can draw upon today. So rather than just having people hand off the batons and saying, I'm done with my part, Mr. Edison, now I'm going to give this to my other teammate, Edison liked to think about collaboration more like a three-legged race, where you're strapped together with several people and you've got to learn how to maneuver. You've got to learn how to work together and keep the speed in play. Now, sometimes you're going to fall down and you're going to have to pick someone up, but you're going to develop your own cadence and your own rhythm, and in that process, learn from each other. So this is more about what collaboration meant to Edison. Now, at Cisco, you have a very powerful model, the LAMS operating model, which I think has many outstanding aspects to it. And each of you works in different aspects of this model, some of you in more than one. But I think we can look to the model and identify where could things be emphasized more in a more focused way, where could things possibly be changed, so that we can endeavor an Edisonian form of collaboration. So I'd like to address that in the next few minutes. If you were to define collaboration, I imagine that you might come up with a definition that's a little bit different than the one you see here. This is really how Edison defined collaboration, applying discovery learning within a context of complexity, inspired by a common goal or a shared purpose. So, extraordinarily enough, Edison realized that collaboration was hard, that it's complex. So, in fact, he organized his teams for complexity. A lot of times we organize our teams for efficiency. And when we do that, some of that learning and some of that shared expertise disappears. As well, some of the breakthrough thinking is diminished. So part of what I want you to be listening for in these next few slides is this notion of complexity, as well as sharing a purpose together. Why is the team together? What is that higher purpose that they are serving? These are parts of Edison's definition of collaboration that I think are extremely important. So if we think about Edison's mindset, how did he begin his endeavors? He wanted to believe that not only was a solution possible, but multiple solutions were possible. Edison actually emphasized the fact that there was more than one answer, and he had a powerful belief that was actually contagious in the laboratory, this optimism that the solution could be found, that it was out there, and he would find it. And if you look at this quote here, it sort of emphasizes this persistence and this desire to keep moving forward. We think about Edison as someone who failed many times. He had experiments that did not come to fruition, thousands of experiments which did not take him in the direction that he anticipated. But optimism kept him going. He wanted to learn from every experience. So he knit together this sense of curiosity and optimism and persistence. So that was a big part of the mindset of the entire laboratory. Also important was this notion of discovery. I talked about collaboration as discovery learning. One of the most important things that Edison taught his employees was to ask questions, not just to always go on facts or things that had existed previously. He wanted them to ask questions that were powerful and unique. For example, when they were endeavoring incandescence, Edison reviewed 40 years worth of data that more than 21 scientists had generated, and they had not succeeded in creating a working incandescent lamp. And Edison looked at the question that these scientists had been asking. Now, incandescence is the process of a substance emitting heat and light without being consumed. So if we look at logs in a fireplace, that's not an example of incandescence. So very hard to find that compound that is going to allow this heating and lighting to take place without collapsing. So Edison looked at this data, and what he realized was that these scientists were asking, what will burn the longest? And that is what bounded their thinking. So Edison realized if he asked that same question, he was going to end up in the same place. So he devised a different question, which was, how do substances burn? Now, it seems kind of extraordinary to us, to our modern ears. But this is where Edison began looking at over 100 compounds, bark and tar and hemp fiber and boar bristles and human hair, things that could never really solve the problem. But what Edison was trying to understand was the properties of burning. And what he discovered was that bamboo fiber was the answer. It had uniform cellular structure from end to end. It could be impregnated with carbon, it could be twisted, it could be baked, and it would retain its properties of even burning. Evenness of burning was the key. So Edison realized that he had to ask unique questions if he was going to create unique technologies. So when we look at his notebooks and we look at his processes, we need to keep this in mind. Edison began with an objective mindset. He wanted to think about ways that he could look at problems and create unique solutions. He was a telegrapher and liked to solve problems very quickly. He was employed by Western Union for many years and became known as a crack troubleshooter. So he was sent to England to solve some problems in telegraphy there because the telegraph lines had to go underneath the English Channel and they had different problems of pressure. The signals were getting distorted. Edison did a number of experiments to try to understand some of the distortion properties of these signals. And in one instance, he created a 26-foot-long dot. In the world of Morse code, they dealt with dots and dashes. So one of his solutions created this 26-foot dot, and he could never figure out what had happened with this until years later, when he was trying to create amplification of the human voice through carbon granules. And he was able to amplify sound using the same technique that he tried to use to solve his telegraphy problem. These carbon granules amplified sound perfectly clearly. So he had to let go of thinking that he could create the answer and always know the solution immediately. He had to keep experimenting, keep discovering, and be objective about the outcomes. When he was looking at the world of recorded sound, his first invention was a cylindrical record. And over time, he had to let go of the cylindrical shape and move to a flat record. He invented document duplication through a stenciling technology and later had to let that go for a rotating drum technology. He realized that he couldn't always just sense and respond and use the things that he knew a lot about. He had to look forward and anticipate and create new things. And he had to lead and guide his customers in that way. So one of the most extraordinary examples I think we see here is Edison's development of the battery, which was portable power. Portable power coming from the man who had given us the grid. The person who had told us that actually you generate power by plugging things in or flipping a switch and light is created. So portable power became a disruptive way to generate power in the middle of a field, to generate power in a forest. So Edison had generated trust with his customers. He had served their needs and solved their problems, but he had to guide them toward new behaviors. He had to guide them toward new mindsets. So it wasn't enough just to understand the grid and have the grid. He wasn't wanting to let go of the grid, but he wanted people to add new knowledge, to begin using new forms of power. And the battery was one example of that. So if we think about these qualities of collaboration that Edison had to draw forward in his teams, we can look at 4 specific aspects. And these 4 qualities I describe as the 4 phases of collaboration. These are enumerated in Midnight Lunch. The first is capacity, the second is context, the third, coherence, and the fourth, complexity. So I'm just going to highlight each of these for you briefly and offer some examples of how you can begin adopting these approaches in your own work. Capacity is really the starting point. Capacity is where we see Edison beginning to create a collegial environment in the laboratory. Midnight lunches were an activity that Edison enjoyed after hours. He would come back to the lab around 7 o'clock, check on his experiments, and then he would talk to the other people who were also in the lab working late, some 7, 8, 9 people on any given night. He would have them share their experiments with each other. Even if they didn't have the same areas of expertise, what he realized was that by sharing their experiments and swapping notebooks, they were seeing patterns in what their colleagues were working on. They were able to ask questions without risk. They were able to endeavor in new areas of knowledge. So these dialogues took place for about 2 hours, and at 9 o'clock, Edison would order in food for everyone from a local tavern. So they'd have sandwiches and beverages, and they'd just have social conversation, talk about their personal lives. Then at 10 o'clock, go back to work until midnight. So midnight lunch became a time when the playing field was equal, when everybody had a say, when there was no particular agenda and no one from HR was giving you any dings for asking something that might sound preposterous to others. So this capacity to collaborate started with collegiality. It started with this process of sharing social time and work time. Context very important in Edison's work. He wasn't just interested in all the facts and data. He wanted to create a context around the problems that he was solving, similar to the incandescent electric light example that I gave. He wanted to experiment. He wanted to prototype very rapidly. Today we can create simulations. We can do work with computers that actually help us solve problems in ways that were very different to how Edison could solve them. This is where those unique questions also come into play. So thinking about a problem and building context around it, as opposed to only looking at it from a task orientation, is extremely important in true collaboration. Coherence. This is one of the toughest ones. Keeping a team together, keeping them focused on a sense of purpose, on the bigger picture. Edison was very good at this because he had to endeavor some of these projects for years at a time. If we think about what it takes to keep a team together, part of it is a common definition of progress. It isn't just how many clients did I serve this quarter, what speed did I have in completing the assignments that I was given and solving the problems that I was given. It's also, were our communications effective? Were we able to communicate easily and readily? Were we able to have influence? So some of the metrics, I think, can be expanded to include these types of communications. Edison was a high communicator, and he liked to write pithy notes. He would write letters, he would even send telegraphs to some of his employees. But he was very brief, and this helped people pay attention. So thinking about progress, how do you define progress? This is part of the coherence factor of collaboration. And finally, complexity. Edison endeavored massively complex projects, capturing the human voice for the first time ever, creating motion pictures, projecting the movies, creating the first power grid, very complex assignments. And there were some factors that allowed Edison to move very quickly in these endeavors. One was these small teams that I described. He liked to have fewer moving parts in the absolute as he was looking at putting systems together. He wanted to have unique combinations of talent that could bring thinking to the conversation that would not otherwise be available. And importantly, Edison believed in networks, not just hierarchies. By having networked communication that actually ran horizontally in the laboratory, much like computers do today, he was able to move faster than what was possible if you constantly had to get approval for every level of your idea. So navigating complexity was very important to Edison, and he was very successful at it. So thinking about your LAMS model and how you can anticipate and guide your customers, how you can bring their needs to the center of your work, I think calls for additional focus on the analyze function so that you can be thinking about not only what is happening, but the needs that you're serving. Are the needs changing? What are the patterns involved with that? And as well, the sharing function. How are you sharing expertise? What can different groups offer that your own individual group might be missing? So those are two areas that I think that you could build out on and emphasize further. So summarizing, a mindset of optimism, objectivity, and discovery were very central to Edison in his collaboration and innovation success. He believed it was important to anticipate the problems and needs of his customers and guide them to new behaviors, not just always solve the problems that they had today. He wanted to emphasize diversity in his dialogue, diversity in his workforce, as well as casual conversation, building context through questions, not just facts, sharing definitions of progress, understanding that everyone had similar sense of progress, not just quantitatively, but qualitatively. And finally, organizing for complexity, not just organizing for efficiency. So I hope that there are some tools here that you can begin using as you work forward in your teams and your work with your customers. It's been such a pleasure having this time with you. So I look forward to our conversation. Thank you so much.
I'll take that from you.
Okay, great.
So I'm gonna let you sit down quite yet. So, So I'll give people a little thought process if they want to ask any questions that we get in real quick. But, you know, the interesting thing here, and I'm listening, I took a lot of notes and I wrote them, and so forgive the notepad. The skill sets you started to talk about, right, where you talk about innovation, collaboration. One you touched on was passion.
Yes.
You know, and I'm going to assume, and let you verify, when you talk about passion in that context, to be able to innovate every day for the entire career of your life, you really have to come with some passion.
Absolutely.
So elaborate on how people start to think in that context.
Sure. Yeah. Well, Edison had 200 companies, so he also had to perform and act. He had to do things that were immediately in front of him. But he always set time aside for the new thinking, the new ideas, the notebook writing, the things that seemed to be forming patterns in his mind. He paid attention to those. He didn't just push them to the side. So I think part of our passion as innovators is to start seeing those ideas that we form as we're working and not ignore them. Start tracking them, start keeping tabs on them, write them down or share them with your colleagues. So part of the passion comes through the dialogue and through the sharing. It gives you momentum to continue.
Well, and that, actually, Lisa, one of the other notes I wrote is you talked about having to let go, right? And I'll tell you this, and I wrote it twice, actually 3 times. Dan. And this is one thing I think our company really struggles with, right? Is letting go. We get passion, and that passion turns to emotional attachment of a product, project, direction, behavior.
Yes.
So if you look at that in the context of dealing with the other, Fortune 500 companies you've talked to, and guiding other companies to direction, what's kind of the advice you want to give us in how do you transition that letting go of some of these things so you can do the new things, right? To your point.
Exactly. I think part of it begins creating a baseline for objectivity and neutrality. And often a good beginning point there is the asking of questions, those unique questions, but also an understanding of needs. Okay. Because if you can see how the old way might not be as fully meeting the needs of your customers, it helps you release some of that attachment and go on to fulfilling those needs in new ways. Okay. So if you can put the needs as a baseline, it becomes a more objective beginning point, as opposed to budget issues or the emotional attachment that you've described.
Which is where you referenced the LAMS model, where we need to look to that first section. What are the needs? Okay.
Yes.
Any questions here in the audience?
Sarah, you talked about repeat success. I agree with that, but sometimes, failure is part of your success. And what I notice, yes, people are having those fears of failures. And even though they want to repeat success, sometimes it may not happen. So what is your advice to those people, how to change their mindset?
Well, Edison looked at everything he did as a learning process. Those failed experiments, 10,000 failed experiments as he was inventing the battery over a series of years. He looked at it as learning. And if we can think about failure as a hypothesis that did not bear out, then you go on to the next hypothesis. And this is part of the agility, is the ability to create a new hypothesis. Why do we think this failed? How could we create a new if-then? So I was reading an article that John Chambers wrote for the Harvard Business Review that just came out this month. And he was talking about flip and how flip did not work within Cisco. And he was saying, you know what? We didn't move fast enough. We didn't anticipate the needs quickly enough and that new environment that we could have created. So that was great learning. That it wasn't we made a bad acquisition. It was we didn't move in the ways that we needed to. We could have been more nimble. Great. On to the next. So that emotional attachment, I think you want to be able to release that.
Awesome. Thank you so much for your time. You're going to stick around, right?
Yes,
so this group will have some questions. And then what we'll do is we've got some of your books for everybody. Well, if you're online, let me know, and I'll make sure you get a book as well. So thank you so much for your time.
Such a pleasure.
All right.
Thank you.
Great. Stick around for a minute here.